Hello, everyone, and a very warm welcome to today's webinar, How to Monitor Windows with Icinga. While we wait for everyone to join, you can drop a quick hello in the chat and also maybe let us know how many Windows servers you are currently monitoring. Just a rough number is fine, like 5 or 10 or 500, or maybe, honestly, I've lost count. Before we dive in, a few housekeeping notes from my side. This session here is being recorded, and you'll receive the recording by email in the next couple of days. So you don't have to worry if you miss something or need to step away or something. While we do the webinar, you can use the Q&A panel. You will find it on the top of your screen here. Throughout the session to drop your questions as they come to your mind. Sometimes, depending on how you're joining, if you're joining through the browser, probably the Q&A section is not available. In that case, you can also just use the chat to ask your questions. And we will address them during the dedicated Q&A block at the end. And if the time allows, even between the session. Great. With that out of the way, let's get started. I'm Blarim, and I'll be your host for the next hour. With me today is Christian. He's the main actor in the Icinga for Windows development, from the concept to the development to updates and features. He's basically involved in every piece of Icinga for Windows. So you are today in the best hands for this webinar. For those of you who are joining us for the first time and maybe don't know what Icinga is, just a few notes on that. Icinga is an open source monitoring solution. It's built and maintained here in Nuremberg, Germany, and we've been around since 2009. The goal of Icinga is very simple. We want to give IT teams full visibility into their infrastructure, to servers, networks, cloud, containers, and of course also Windows. Our goal is to do it without vendor login and also without compromises. Today, thousands of organizations use Icinga to keep their systems running, ranging from small IT shops all the way to enterprises monitoring hundreds of thousands of servers. And Windows environments are typically a huge part of that story. And that brings me to the next point. If you work in IT operations, there is a very good chance that you have Windows somewhere in your stack. Maybe it's a fleet of a bunch of Windows servers running Active Directory, file shares, SQL servers. Maybe it's a virtual desktop, print servers, or that legacy application nobody wants to touch anymore. Windows, if we like it or not, is typically everywhere. And it usually is running things that if they break, people have to notice very quickly. And yet, in my experience, Windows monitoring is one of the areas where IT teams most often feel like they're flying blind, kind of. And why is that? Windows has a huge surface area. CPU, memory, disk, yes, but also services, scheduled tasks. You have event logs, updates, certificates, dozens of applications. Just grabbing is a server up or down, ping doesn't quite cut it. Many teams run hybrid environments, a mix of Linux and Windows. But the tools that work brilliantly on Linux not always feel native on Windows. You end up with a separate dashboard, separate alerting rules, separate on-call workflows. It gets messy very fast. Windows checks often rely on WMI or WinRM, and getting those configured securely and consistently across hundreds of machines is not quite trivial. And then there's the maintenance side as well. Every patch cycle, every new server that you roll out that your rollout can quickly change, and every group policy that you change can break your monitoring if you're not careful. As a result of that, teams discover problems from their users instead of their monitoring tool. A file share is suddenly unreachable. A scheduled backup hasn't run for 3 days maybe. A service is flapping and nobody knew. And that's exactly the kind of situation good monitoring should prevent. And this is exactly where Icinga for Windows comes in. It's a dedicated framework designed to bring the same power and flexibility Icinga users enjoy on Linux to the Windows world. With a clean installation process, a growing library of built-in checks, and tight integration with the rest of your Icinga stack. So, what are you going to see today? Christian is going to walk us through live how to get Icinga for Windows installed from scratch. He will give us a tour of the core components, so you understand what's doing what and what is doing it under the hood. And then he will show us how to configure the essential checks everyone should have. We will also look at how to connect Windows agents back into your central Icinga environment. And Christian will share some practical tips for keeping it all reliable as your environment grows. And at the end, as I mentioned before, we will have some time for Q&A. So please feel free to drop your questions into the Q&A panel or into the chat so we can handle them later. With all of that said, I would say let's get into it. I'm delighted to hand over to Christian, who is going to be your guide for the rest of the session. Christian, over to you.
Thank you very much, Valery. Welcome, everyone, and thanks for joining today's webinar. We will have some hands-on demo handling and showcase on how you can start with Icinga for Windows, basically from scratch. I think my screen should be shared right now. So what I have here in my setup right now, we have Windows Server 2025 right now, which we will install Icinga for Windows on, and we have a basic newly Icinga installation with the Icinga director. We don't have any host right now besides the basic host here. We have some service templates and the default commands from Icinga, but no Icinga for Windows components right now, because we start basically from scratch now to give you the entire showcase on how you can do stuff. So let's get started first. What basically is Icinga for Windows? When you head, for example, to the Icinga web page, the best entry point is the documentation, and then have a look on the Icinga for Windows section, which will guide you through the entire installation process with detailed guides and also error handling. Basically, what you require to run Icinga for Windows is PowerShell, of course, because we decided to use PowerShell as a basic runtime for our checks and for the framework, because Windows comes natively with it. For that reason, Icinga for Windows works starting from Windows 8 to 2025. There is some smaller issue with 2012 and 2012 R2, because those systems are way older. They ship with an older version of the PowerShell. It still works natively on these machines, but the experience is not as great as starting from 2016, for example. But it still works. And finally, this operating system is end of life by the end of year, so I can hopefully finally ditch it. If you have older systems like Windows 7 or 2008 R2, it might work. We try our best to make it as maintainable as possible, but hopefully no one is using 2008 R2 or older versions. So the basic requirement is PowerShell 4. and .NET Framework 4 or later. Every Windows machine running PowerShell 5.1 starting with 2016 is fine. That's no big of a hassle. And PowerShell 7 is right now not supported. Not sure how many people are running PowerShell 7. Would be funny if you can write a comment about that for me to later look up if you have machines you install PowerShell 7 on, because Icinga for Windows was not built for that, but we're working on it. So what is recommended? PowerShell 5.1, that's fine. That's natively shipped starting with 2016, and the .NET Framework 4.7 or later, for example, because of the Icinga agent, because that's the requirement 4.6, for example. So how does Icinga for Windows? Let's get a brief summary. What is Icinga for Windows? We always talk about in the Icinga agent context and in PowerShell context about Icinga for Windows. Icinga for Windows is a bunch of components bundled into a solution. So that means we have the Icinga PowerShell framework, which Blerim just told us about, which is containing all required core components to manage the Icinga agent, to manage, update, and administrate the Icinga for Windows experience. And then we have a bunch of additional extensions for the Icinga PowerShell plugins, as example, which then ship with the memory load and service checks. We also have an inventory module, which gives some information of the Windows system printed out. We have Hyper-V checks, MS SQL checks, cluster and ISS plugins, and these are all independent components, so you can just install and maintain the component you actually require on your system to not have everything installed at once. And on top of that comes the Icinga agent, which is then integrated natively directly with Icinga for Windows, which I will show in the demo case. So we have all the PowerShell components and the Icinga agent, and those components work together to give the best user experience and an overall satisfying monitoring result. So when you do upgrades with Icinga for Windows, for example, or general Icinga, what you should do is always have a look on the changelog, for example, because sometimes it could be that there are some breaking changes. We try to avoid them as much as possible. Sometimes we can't resolve a certain issue, but it's very, very rarely. On the other hand, when you do update your environment, we have a migration assistant, which will, for example, migrate certain configurations to the next version to ensure everything runs smoothly, and we can have a look on that. For the getting started part, that's a re-summary again on some requirements. And what we have here, for example, is our first script to get Icinga for Windows running. So what Icinga for Windows does, we build a kickstart script, which is available on packages Icinga.com for the download. So what this script does, for example, is it will give you an option to download Icinga for Windows, the PowerShell framework of the component, into the module directory, the PowerShell module directory. You can add an install command for automated installation. We will come to that later. And it will deal with everything required to get the PowerShell component installed and running and ready on your environment. That is basically what the entire Kickstarter does. And what we also build is some sort of repository management, which means we have the stable repository. You see all kinds of components here. And then we have a repository index file, which will tell us file hashes, versions, architecture, and where our components are located, which is required for making installation and updating of components as easy as possible, because everything is written in these index files, and you can also use these index files to create your own local repository. So for example, if you're running behind proxy servers or you have Windows machines which are not allowed to connect to the internet, you can clone this repository on a local web server or local file share and install your Icinga for Windows solution from this location. We don't have time today to focus on that part. We just use packages Icinga.com. But in general, it is possible to build your own repository, also to include your own components you may write for Icinga for Windows, like your own custom plugins. So for getting started, let's just try this out. So we have this script. What does the script do? It will tell us to download the kickstart file from packages.icinga.com and then simply run this file. And when we do that, we have some options already that are given to us, like the default location where the Icinga for Windows is installed, which is in this case C program files, Windows PowerShell modules, and everything is down in the temp folder. And now Icinga for Windows will be installed. We see there are pending migrations that are always applied to ensure that certain tasks are properly configured or properly handled and so on. And once this part is done, the framework itself is ready. So if we have a look, for example, we have, this is the default location, and we have the Icinga PowerShell framework installed here right now. And what Icinga for Windows now does is it asks me if I want to use the management console. And the management console is a text-based UI that will allow me to now configure my Icinga for Windows installation. And the idea for this entire part is basically that you get a basic starting point from which you can create your own configurations. You can then save and use them to deploy Icinga for Windows automated without any user interaction in your entire environment. So I click yes. And then let's start with the Icinga for Windows Management Console. It can take a while. And what the Management Console allows me to do is to get ahead of everything. So configuring my endpoints, my certificate authority, which should be used for Icinga, if I want to use a ticket, and everything like that. So let's start with base installation. And then we have four options. We can use the Icinga Director Self-Service API, and we can also simply connect from this system to a remote location. I will do this one first, and we do the Director later on, if we have time left. So the highlighted parts in this green, bluish color, cyan color, are the default values, also mentioned here. And you can simply press enter, and it will tell you, okay, what's your host name? We're not part of a domain yet, so the FQDN is not set, but we can decide, do we want the FQDN like it is written in the system? Do you want lowercase, uppercase, or do you simply want a host name? In this case, we can go with the FQDN. That depends a little on your environment. Very important in the part, the name that's listed here is the same name that has to be the object name within your Icinga environment later on. So these names need to match your object name to make sure the agent communication is handled properly. So we press enter, then it tells us what the master or the parent zone is. In that case, it's master. Let's check that. We go to our, in this case, Icinga Director, Icinga Infrastructure. Then let's have a look on the zones. And we have the master zone here. We have the endpoints, and it's also master zone, so that's fine. We can continue with that. And now we need to add our parent nodes, and we can add up to 2 nodes because Icinga supports up to 2 nodes within each zone. So I can copy the name of my parent endpoint and add it here. If, for example, I would have another endpoint right now, I could add it here as well. I can't add a third option because Icinga does only support 2. If I make I made a mistake, I can press simple D to delete the entry and then re-add my value again by simply pressing enter. So it's a very, very simple text UI that allows me to manage everything. Now I press enter, and then it directly jumps to the conclusion mask. And you see here, parent address, it resolved it to the actual IP address instead of the FQDN, because this address here was resolvable, and Icinga for Windows will automatically resolve it to the IP address to make sure that in certain cases of DNS failures or whatsoever, that you're still able to connect to Icinga. When I press A, I can add the advanced tab and can do a lot more management, because right now we have the option connect from the system. We have our host name configured, the zone, our parent nodes, and the parent address. And if we go in the advanced detail, we see, for example, a lot more details what we could configure. For example, the listen import, if we want to open the Windows firewall for incoming connections, if you want to enforce the certificate creation, we have the global templates and director global zone, which is automatically added. The agent version is set to release, which means it will look inside the Icinga for Windows repository and then install the latest version of the agent found. I could, for example, also say, let's install, I think 2.15.2 is the latest version. I could also add the version here, for example, and ensure that only 2.15.2 is installed. I can say if I wanted to install the agent or not. I can change the agent directory location, the service user. I want to install the plugins, so the Icinga PowerShell plugins component. I want to install the Icinga for Windows service, which I come to later in addition. Then packages Icinga.com is used as our stable repository. And I skip JR for now. We do that at the end. I want to enable our API check feature, which I can showcase later on. And basically, that's it. And that's now my configuration for Icinga for Windows. And when I hit, wait, that's wrong. Let me change one thing, certificate. We want to sign it with a ticket. And then let me have a look. Hosts. Add new host. Host installed with Icinga 2 agent. And now we say Icinga webinar. Host address. I don't know, but it doesn't matter anyway. So that's great. Awesome. Now, so I now create the host object and established connection. Yes, yes, add. And when I go to the agent tab, I now get the ticket for the certificate creation. I simply copy that one and paste it here. And now this ticket will be used to sign the certificate for the Icinga agent to make sure that the agent communication is possible, is TLS encrypted, and no one can see what actually is transported within the Icinga protocol. Now this is done. I simply press enter And then we have the option to start the installation. I can export the answer file, or I can print the installation command, for example, or simply save the configuration and return to the menu. So if I go with 2 now, print installation command, we, for example, get this output, which is a simple JSON. I can copy this entire command and use this command later on to install Icinga for Windows with the same configuration on my machine, which is, quite frankly, not that great of an idea because the ticket will not match in that case. But for example, if you know the ticket, somehow you fetch the ticket beforehand from your automation process, you can place it here in this JSON installation command, for example, or you can use the Icinga director, which we'll do later on, which will do everything for you and you don't have to care about anything. So I can simply copy that. I store it for later somewhere now, because it's fine. If I press P, I return to the previous menu, and now we can start the installation, for example. There's one small thing I just need to check to make sure. That's fine, yeah. So, and then we simply press start installation, and hopefully everything goes smoothly now. And what happens now? Based on my configuration, we see the agent 2.15.2 is downloaded from packages Icinga.com. The agent is now installed at this location, and then all configurations are done, including security permissions to ensure that no one can actually access those paths. And the SCR is wrong. I guessed it. Well, that's fine. We can fix that. That's no problem. Let me have a look. That one is created. Let me have a look. I guessed it was wrong. Okay. So, and basically what happens now is all components are installed, the plugins are installed now. There are some security checks that are done and some updates, which currently do not apply because we run the network service user. So the entire permission handling and granting users to run as a service object is all not required because network service is already allowed to run as a service because it's the default. And we also see that, for example, the REST API is now being configured from Icinga for Windows. So why do I talk about the REST API? Icinga for Windows, the PowerShell components itself are really, really great for the monitoring task and to fetch all Windows relevant information. But a bigger issue, for example, is always that if the Icinga agent has always to start the PowerShell, it will create a huge amount of load on your Windows machine. And for that, we created the Icinga for Windows API, which will then streamline everything because we can simply connect to a PowerShell HTTPS endpoint and then execute our checks from there. So now this failed, the certificate configuration failed because the IP address obviously was not possible. So let's go with base installation again. That's option 0. And then instead of new configuration, we do now 2, reconfigure environment. And then we press 20 for our certificate authority server. We remove that one and add that one. Now that is done, I can print installation command again. And because I changed the option, it is now also present within my configuration command, because everything which is not part of the default option is not printed here to make the output as clean as possible. Once you change a value from the default value to something else, then it will be printed here to give you a better understanding. And now I simply do the installation again. And now the agent is downloaded again, but it's not installed because it was already installed. And now we can see TLS certificate. The certificate is fetched, it's handled. And we can ignore that part because the service is already running and installed. It's just a race condition, that's fine. We just pretend this never happened, these two errors. We don't see them. And now the certificate is installed and we should be able, if we deploy our pending changes in Icinga, we should at least be able to see some results. So now as the installation basically is done, we have to get started with, okay, I have the plugins installed, what's next? So the bigger issue here is that whenever you made configurations with Icinga, for example, install check commands from the internet, or even if you use the IPL, there's always the issue that, for example, you have a great preview of fields that are possible. You have lots of fields here, for example. You can select all those fields and then you have to add those fields and assign them if they're mandatory or not, which can be quite a hassle because if you have a plugin with 20 options, you require every single of them. You need to add 20 custom fields and then a description and a data type and everything related. What Icinga for Windows does is if you, for example, go to the GitHub page. I just do it for the GitHub page right now. But in general, if you, let's have a look, you install the plugins, for example. Each component that includes plugins from Icinga for Windows side has a folder config included. So I'm switching to the 114 branch right now. And then we have config. And here we have the Icinga director configuration, Grafana configuration for dashboards, and our Icinga plain config configuration. So these config objects are all pre-compiled with Icinga for Windows. So for example, with the director, we have basket configurations for every single check command available, but also a plugins bundle JSON for importing everything. Same goes for the Icinga configuration. There's the plugins bundle conf, which include every single check command config. So basically, you can, if you, for example, only use the CPU plugin, you can simply install only the CPU configuration. If you want to have every plugin available anyway, you can use this plugins bundle conf and place it into your Icinga conf directory. Now, as we have the Icinga director, let's just download the plugins bundle JSON. Let's open that and then click download raw file. Then we have our JSON object here. If you have Icinga for Windows installed, the Icinga PowerShell plugins folder also comes with the config folder. So I could also use basically this version here, which is now identical because I picked the 114 branch. But basically it's identical, so it doesn't really matter which one you use. So let's head to Icinga Web, to the Icinga director, and then we go to configuration baskets. Then we click upload. We say, give it a name, webinar. Then let's head to downloads, plugins bundle. We open that, and then we click on upload. And now we don't have to do anything on this page here. We just need to hit on snapshots, click on the snapshot that's created here, and then we see a bunch of data lists, data fields, and commands that are being generated from this basket import. So if we go now and click on restore, DirectoDB, that's fine. We click on restore. And now, if I go to the activity log, we see that a bunch of check commands has been created by this basket. And if you now head to the command section, we can, for example, have a look here. Here is it, invoke Icinga check CPU. And we have the custom properties. And every single argument that is present within this check command is already applied with a custom field and with options. So for example, if you want that a plugin does not provide performance data, you can simply add yes here, because it's a yes/no field, or as a switch in the PowerShell plugin, which has the option present yes or no, and you can set it here. Or for example, for the event log check, you can exclude certain entry types. All this information are directly coming from the plugin. Also, everything that should be an array is already considered a proper array. And let me have a look what I have. Firewall, I think, is a good example. We have, for example, the profiles you can include, and the entire description from the argument is already included here as well, what kind of profiles are available. And with that, it's very easy to actually get things running and working, because you don't have to reverse engineer the plugin. What kind of argument can you, or what kind of value can you pass to an argument? Because Icinga for Windows simply does that for you. So for example, for the service check plugin, I could say if the service is not found, I can say, yeah, it's fine, it's okay. I can override that. That's part of the plugin, but the actual value is part of the plugin itself, and therefore part of the configuration. Same goes for the status, if you want to check if a service is running or not. Well, now we have our check commands included. Let's create a service template with the director to actually do some monitoring. So let's do load. No, we don't need that. That's wrong. Invoke Icinga check CPU. Let's do the check execution. I should have created a basic template for that. That would have been great. So let's do that. Check timeout. Let's do 60 seconds. Yes, active checks, passive checks, send notifications. So that's basically what you would do for a basic template in general for best practice. I just do it here right now because I don't have a generic template available. And now I have my plugin configuration. And now, for example, I can go with, let's say critical is 60% and warning is 50% for my threshold. And we can simply say add. And one important thing, run on agent, yes. That's the very important part, because you want to make sure that your plugin is, or your check is actually executed on the agent. Otherwise, it's executed from the master or the satellite, which is not gonna work then. So we do that. And now we have a service template, and I do it very simple now. I click on this host, services, add a service, and then we do the Icinga for Windows load check. I could override these values now here as well. I click on add, and then let's deploy everything. And with some luck, everything should work. So the installation here is done. It tells me that the package is already installed. The domain admin group is not valid. It's fine because we're not part of a domain. Your trusted master certificate is not present. What? Why? Okay, let's have a look on that. So with X, I can close this. And what we can do now, because we run some issues, we can run the command. No, not that. So we can run the command test Icinga for Windows, which is the best command to use if you want to troubleshoot something, if you have issues, for example. you can simply run this command and it will tell you if there are some parts of your installation that are currently broken. So, for example, it will now collect some environment information. It will tell me, yeah, the service binary is installed and exists. The agent is installed. And that will take some time now. And then we see some additional audit messages. For example, there was some security part that was not properly handled beforehand. It will be checked. We have the users being checked, for example, that Icinga for Windows. Like I said, we have an Icinga for Windows service and the Icinga agent. And it basically means you can't tell a Windows system to simply run a PowerShell as a service. That's not possible. We require a wrapper script for that. And therefore, there is a C# binary that will then start the PowerShell. So you can have it run like a regular service as started. We have some permission check here. The state file is healthy, everything is done, and that should be fine. The REST API is also working properly. The CR is also valid and properly signed. So basically, it should work. So let's get back to our monitoring and check if it's actually working. And it's working. We have a check. And now we have a load check and we see we have one socket right now in the output, and core 6 is exceeding our thresholds, which we used. So what I can do now, for example, is if I want to get an idea on what the Icinga agent does, we have the read Icinga agent log file command. And this command is very interesting because what it will do, depending if you have the latest version, which will use the event log from Windows, or if you use the log file, the simple log file, doesn't matter. It will give you an output, a tail, like on Linux, you do a tail -f, your log file, and then you see all events that come after that. Icinga for Windows does that as well with read Icinga agent log file. And if new events would pop up here, then they would be added here as well, which means you can do your stuff and see, okay, what is happening in the log, for example. So that's fine. What's also important here is that the event log feature with Icinga for Windows is configured to only write warning logs and more severe. So we have the information logs here, for example. That was the part when Icinga is first installed the agent, then it's in the information state. Icinga for Windows changes the configuration by default to get the warning flag there to ensure that the application log is not entirely spammed. So basically, now our plugin output is here. Now we have OK, and we could add additional checks right now, for example. And basically, that's the very, very brief handling on how you can install it from scratch without using the Icinga director as the source, for example, in a quite straightforward way. And for example, we can add a new check now. Just to give an idea of one additional thing that's very interesting. If we time, where's the time sync plugin? Here it is. And now let's do, for example, time offset. No, we want warning, for example. Let's do minus 10 ms, 10 ms. So what Icinga for Windows also does, which is quite interesting, is that we properly support the Nagios threshold guidelines. So that means when you have certain values, certain ranges that vary from negative to positive values, for example, you can very, very easily change the behavior. So give me a quick look, because Blarium already is taking over. So I'm looking on the clock just to make sure I don't get extended. Otherwise, Blarium will come here in the room.
Take your time.
Otherwise, Blarium will come in the room here. And okay. Do you have any questions right now beforehand?
Well, yeah. I collected a bunch of questions. So first of all, thank you, Christian. Also, especially for staying in time. I know it's very hard for you because you would love to talk for hours about this. Our goal this time for this webinar was to keep it brief so everyone has the chance to get started with Icinga for Windows. So thanks for providing that. During the session, I've collected a bunch of questions. I will not cover those that has been answered already in the chat. As usual, we have a very highly active community also in the webinars. So it sometimes happens that they answer questions to each other. That's really cool. One of the questions that was raised was that when you are a user of NS Client right now, which was like the default agent for Icinga for years. If you are a user of NS Client right now, how would you migrate to Icinga for Windows? Is there anything to keep in mind? Is there any best practice? What should I do?
That's a good question, actually. So it depends a lot on what the DNS client is currently covering for your monitoring. So the biggest part that could come in mind, for example, that's sometimes a little irritating, is the service check plugin Icinga for Windows is using. That's the only thing to keep in mind. We try to cover every single plugin that is the DNS client did. We also have something like background tasks, so collect metrics over time. So we have installation, collect metrics over time. So for example, what the DNS client did, what Linux, for example, has is load 1.5.15, for example. That's something we built also directly into Icinga for Windows. So you can register the background service check daemon. And what you can then do is register a plugin, configure interval that is run, and then collect the averages from, for example, 1, 3, 5, and 15 minutes. So that means that if you want not to check, for example, your CPU load on, okay, I have 80% now, but I don't care. I want to get alerted if I have 80% over the last 15 minutes on average, then this is, for example, something you should keep in mind. You can right now do this for multiple plugins, for example, also for the partition space plugin. It gets a little complicated when you do performance counters or something like that, but that's something you should keep in mind. Otherwise, the plugins itself are relatively straightforward. The configuration is mostly similar, except, like I said, for the service check plugin. Because what the service check plugin by default will do, it will collect all services that are configured to run automatically, and then the plugin will tell you if any of these services is not running. With one exception, if the service itself terminated itself with exit code 0, the Icinga for Windows plugin will not handle it as a critical, even when it's designed to run automatically. So for example, when you use Microsoft Edge or Google Chrome, you have the Edge Updater or the Google Updater service. That's a service that will run on system boot, will update your browser, and then it will terminate itself with exit code 0 if everything went fine. But it should never be part of the monitoring. because it's fine, it's done. And that's something to keep in mind here, that which is the only change that really impacts, and that gets people confused, for example. But otherwise, it's quite straightforward. There's no migration script, but you can, most of the plugins are there. You can simply configure them with your values. You see all the bunch of plugins we imported right now. You have all the basic values there, and then you're fine. And these are all the services right now, for example. And I'm pretty sure we have Edge, for example, and that's the part here I wanted to show. So the Microsoft Edge update service is stopped, but the plugin will report it's okay because the service itself terminated itself with exit code 0, which means it's fine. It's a graceful shutdown.
Perfect. So speaking of check execution, the REST API that you mentioned before, is it correct that it's used locally to actually do the checks?
Yes.
Because people are reporting that they have problems, that the load of the Icinga agent is very high during checks.
Yes. So let's have a look here, because one configuration I want to do it later on. So if I click on inspect here now, because of the director, we see right now that each check will now call the PowerShell. So a new process is started with the PowerShell, and then the check is being executed, which causes a very high load on the machine, especially if you have a very large amount of checks configured. Now, with the REST API, this is a little mitigated in that case, because this function here, the exit Icinga execute plugin, will then tell, okay, the RP is installed, the RP is configured, and will forward a check to the API, execute it there, and the PowerShell will simply receive the result. Now, still the problem is this causes massive load on your infrastructure. And there's one change we made, and a shout out to Alex for that, who built this integration. Starting with 2.14 of the Icinga agent and Icinga for Windows 1.11 and Director 1.11, you can simply go to your check command. Here it is. And when we have a look at the PowerShell base script, you can import the Icinga for Windows API template. Let's store it and then deploy while I go over the documentation. There's also documentation if you're not using the Icinga director. Basically, what will happen now is by using this integrated template, which is nowhere present, it will override the internal check handler to not execute the checks by using the PowerShell, but by using the REST API. So let me have a look what happens now. Inspect. And now we see instead of calling the PowerShell, the Icinga agent will natively call via curl the Icinga for Windows API and queue the check with the Icinga for Windows RP check endpoint, which now means there is no PowerShell being started. There is no overhead. The Icinga agent receives the request to execute a check. It will do a TLS connection to the Icinga for Windows API, execute the check within the API, and then report the result back. And as you can see, it works just fine. And there's also a great benefit with that, because if I do this, because we know some people are very quick on the handling of executing checks, Icinga for Windows will queue all these checks, but only queue them for the amount of API calls. So if you do this 80 times, it will check everything and then it will wait. It will not spawn 80 PowerShell processes now, which can kill your environment with any plugin, basically. So So you have also the soft limiter within the Icinga for Windows API, which is configured to run 5 concurrent checks.
Awesome. Things can get sometimes more complicated, especially when using GEA or GEA, JEA. I don't know honestly how to pronounce it. Let's call it GEA. If you're setting up GEA on an active domain controllers, there are no local users. The domain users' passwords are reset when GEA is enabled on the second domain controller.
Yes.
Are there any recommendations for installing Icinga for Windows with GEA in an environment with multiple domain controllers?
Yes. So what GEA does, just a quick summary, is GEA is just enough administration, which is a security feature for PowerShell to limit the access and write access, for example, for certain parts. Now, the problem is you can simply run this by running install Icinga security. And what this command does, it will create a local user right now by default, which is called Icinga, generate a random password, and then there's a GEA profile generated telling the user is allowed to run these commands. And the problem with that is it works fine in non-domain controllers, but on domain controllers, like you mentioned, you have the user Icinga on one, create it on the second one, and then it will change the user in the domain because domain controllers don't have that. What you can use right now in that part, we are working on this to use group managed service accounts, which is a little hassle. What you can do is you can add the Icinga user argument and, for example, add Icinga DC1 as an individual user. And on the second domain controller, you do Icinga DC2, and on the third one, Icinga DC3. Then you have dedicated users for each domain controller until we figure out how we can add group managed service accounts, which is a priority, to get it run smoothly in the environment. That's a workaround for now. It's not great, but it's the only option right now.
Now that's good to know that at least we have one option to work around it. Final question for today. Now that we are ready to install Icinga for Windows and also to script it and to roll it out, how would you now accomplish a migration process of an old Icinga agent infrastructure to Icinga for Windows? Let's say around about 200 or more Windows servers.
Yeah, so what happens here is when you have the Icinga agent already installed, you most likely already have all the certificates and handling. So what Icinga for Windows does is that the certificates, they are present, so they won't be touched during the installation process. You simply need to tell Icinga for Windows what kind of configuration is there. If you're having the Icinga director, it's a lot easier. And if the Windows machine is actively able to connect to the director, for example, because what you can do in your host templates with your host with installed Icinga 2 agent, you have this agent hub, and you can generate a self-service API key. And what happens is the script block that we have seen before from Icinga.com, from documentation, is now here added with the director self-service key that's mentioned up here, and all the required endpoints and the package server. So what you can do in that case is use the Icinga director to automate everything. Or, for example, if you use Ansible, the SCCM, the System Center Configuration Manager, SCCM, yes, or any other automation solution, you can create your configuration template matching each individual zone of your Icinga environment and automate it by using that, and simply deploy it, run it. The agent will not be touched or will be updated, for example, to the latest version, and then Icinga for Windows will be installed alongside this, this infrastructure. And then you can use the directory or your plain configuration file to add all your checks and service templates, and do a flying migration while keeping the old monitoring like the NS client or the legacy check plugins, while you in addition add the Icinga for Windows check plugins. And once you are done, you can remove the old ones. Did that answer the question?
Yeah, I guess it does. Thank you very much. I would like to wrap it up now. Thank you, Christian, for taking the time, for taking us through Icinga for Windows. We know that these are just the fundamentals, and there's so much more in Icinga for Windows that you can explore. Perhaps we will do a follow-up later this year with more advanced topics. Let's see how it goes. For today, thank you very much for joining us here. Of course, we will move forward with more webinars in the future. We already know what the next one will be. We will discuss the Icinga 2 Terraform provider. So if you're into automation, Terraform, infrastructure as code, these kind of things, that would be the right webinar for you. I will make sure to paste the link in the chat. The registration is already open. Thanks again for joining us today. Thank you, Christian, for guiding us through, and see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you much. Bye.